Hello, this week I'm going to read The Book of Dust, Volume 1 by Philip Pullman. Chapter 3, Lyra. It turned out that instead of waiting obediently for the CCD men to come out and take him away, George Boatwright had vanished. Good for him, thought Malcolm. But no one talked about it or wondered aloud what had happened to him. That was the way of things with the CCD. It was better not to ask, better not to think about it. The atmosphere in the Trout was subdued for some days afterwards. Malcolm went to school, did his homework, fetched and carried in the inn, and read over and over again the secret message in the acorn. It wasn't an easy time. Everything just then seemed hung about with an unhappy air of suspicion and fear, quite unlike the normal world, as Malcolm thought of it, the place he was used to living in, where everything was interesting and happy. Besides, the CCD man had been asking about the Lord Chancellor's companion, and his interest had been in the matter of whether the Priory had ever looked after an infant. And Malcolm thought that the care of infants was probably not the sort of thing the CCD usually bothered with. Acorns containing secret messages, perhaps, but they hadn't mentioned anything like that. It was all very puzzling. In the hope of seeing someone else either leaving or collecting a message from the oak tree, Malcolm went there several times over the next few days, covering up his interest in that little stretch of the canal by watching the great crested graybees. The other thing he did was to hang about in the chandlery. It was a good place to watch the piazza from. People were always going back and forth or stopping to drink coffee in the cafe opposite. They sold all kinds of boat-related stuff in the chandlery, including red paints, of which he bought a small tin and a fine brush to go with it. The woman behind the counter soon realised that his interest didn't stop at red paint. "What else are you looking for, Malcolm?" she said. Her name was Mrs. Carpenter, and she'd known him ever since he was allowed to go out in the canoe on his own. "Some cotton cord," he said. "I showed you what we've got yesterday." "Yes, but maybe there's another reel somewhere." "I don't understand what's wrong with the one I showed you." "It's too thin. I want to make a lanyard, and it's got to be a bit heavier than that." "You could always double it. Use 2 strands instead of 1. "Oh yeah, I suppose I could." "How much you want then?" "About 4 fathoms. Doubled or single?" "Well, 8 of them. That should be enough if I double it." "I should think it would be," she said, and measured the cord and cut it. It was a good thing Malcolm had plenty of money in his tin walrus. Once he'd got the cord stowed away tidily in a big paper bag, he peered out of the window, looking left and right, as he'd been doing for the previous quarter of an hour. "Don't mind me asking," said Mrs. Carpenter, and her drake demon murmured in agreement. "But what are you looking for? You've been staring out there for ever such a long time. You meeting someone, and they not turned up?" No, actually." If he couldn't trust Mrs. Carpenter, he thought, he couldn't trust anyone. "Actually, I'm looking for someone, a man in a grey coat and hat. I saw him the other day and he dropped something and we found it. And I want to give it back to him, but I haven't seen him since." "That's all you can tell me about him? A grey coat and hat? How old was he?" "I didn't see him clearly. I suppose he was about the same age as my dad. He was kind of thin." "Where did he drop this thing you've got along the canal?" "Yes, under a tree, back down the towpath. It's important." "It's not this chap, is it?" Mrs. Carpenter brought the latest Oxford Times out from under the counter and folded it back to an inside page before holding it out for Malcolm to see. Yes, I think that's him. What happened? What? He's been drowned? They found him in the canal. Looked as if he'd just slipped in, apparently. You know how rainy it's been, and they don't look after the towpath as they ought to. He's not the first to lose his footing and fall in. Whatever he lost is too late. And give it back now. Malcolm was reading the story with wide eyes, gulping the words down. The man's name was Robert Luckhurst, and he'd been a scholar of Magdalen College, an historian. He was unmarried and survived by his widowed mother and a brother. There would be an inquest in due course, but there were no signs that his death was anything other than an accident.